Hello and welcome to the Fifth War Films podcast, a podcast where we're talking about 10 classic war films. We did a series like this before called the Adventure Films podcast, where we talked about 10 classic adventure films, but now our theme is war, and today we're going to be talking about the 1964 film It Happened Here. I'm Garen Ewing. I'm a comic artist and writer and illustrator, and I'm doing these podcasts with my brother Murray.
Hello, I'm Murray. I'm a writer. I've got a book out at the moment called The Fantasy Reader.
So the last film we did was A Bridge Too Far, which we recorded in February 2015, and I actually finally got around to editing in December 2015, so there's been a bit of a gap, but there's no schedule for these. So now it's January 2016. Happy New Year. And should we get straight into the film?
Yeah.
This is one that I think perhaps a lot of people might not have heard of before.
Yeah, I certainly think it's the most unusual one you've picked for the 10 films.
Yes.
I hadn't heard of it before.
I'm very enthusiastic about this film. I'm a big fan. But the only reason I heard of it and got introduced to it is through my interest in Charlie Chaplin, where I used to run a website called Chaplin UK in the late 90s. And early 2000s. Well, by the early 2000s, it became the website for the official British Chaplin Society.
Oh, right.
Actually, it wasn't British, it was just the Chaplin Society. I think it was international. And Kevin Brownlow, who directed It Happened Here, was one of the sort of patrons of the Chaplin Society. I went to quite a few silent film events at the BFI in London. And so this is the only director of these films who I've actually met.
Oh, right. Wow.
I met him twice.
Now, it's because of that I'm used to seeing his name on books on your bookshelf, so yes. I thought of him basically as a scholar of silent films and old films.
Yes.
Is this the only film he directed?
He did...
Documentaries, probably.
Yes, yeah. He did. He made basically two main films. He worked on others, and I think he made a very small film before It Happened Here. But he did become... His main life's work has become a restorer of films and a film historian, particularly about the silent era. And that was the thing that got me interested in Kevin Brownlow, was I read a book of his called The Parade's Gone By, which is from 1968, an excellent book about the silent film period. He went and interviewed a lot of the silent film stars who were just about still living in the 60s.
Right.
And that book was the culmination of those interviews. A few years later, many of them had died.
Wow.
When he was a young boy, he got interested in film and became a bit of a film collector. I mean, I'm talking about, age sort of 12, 13, 14.
Right.
And he picked up bits of old film from flea markets that no one was interested in then. It's not like today with eBay and everyone's a collector.
Yeah. And
he found a fragment of a film called Napoleon. He later discovered it was Napoleon. In fact, he swapped it for something else. But anyway, that's a long story. That's a different story. But so he came into possession of a scrap of a film called Napoleon, and Napoleon kind of became his life's work. He restored the film. It was a really sort of avant-garde, amazing film by a director called Abel Gance. In fact, I saw it in 2013. You can't see it on TV or... You can buy it on DVD, but you must never watch it on the small screen. It's a big screen film. I went to see it at the festival hall. It was 5.5 hours long, with a live music score by Carl Davis. He did a lot of restoration. A lot of his restored films had music by Carl Davis. It was amazing. Yeah. But only amazing, I think. If you saw it on the small screen, you probably wouldn't be impressed. But it is very impressive, especially with live orchestra. So he wrote another book about Napoleon, which is, I recommend all his books. The Parade's Gone By, his book about restoring Napoleon, which is, a book that covers a lot of his life. And he also wrote a book called How It Happened Here, which is a book about the making of this film. Yeah.
Right.
So Kevin Brownlow, I went to a talk about Napoleon as well. That was the last time I saw him.
Yeah.
And he's a very quiet, unassuming, I guess shy, as it comes across as shy anyway. And you think, well, how? Because he made It Happened Here when he was 18.
Yeah.
Took him 8 years to make.
I saw that apparently at one point in the Guinness Book of Records it was listed, maybe still is, as the longest production schedule of any film.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, it took 40 days to shoot, but those 40 days were spread over 8 years. Because he was 18, his assistant director, Andrew Mollo, was 16, and when you see the film, it's amazing what they did.
Yeah.
With no budget, pretty much. A couple of kids, basically. But again, as I was saying, Kevin Brownlow is such a quiet, unassuming person.
Yeah.
Yet to get things done, he really, if he wanted to do something, he went and did it. His enthusiasm kind of overrode his character, if you like. That's what it seems, anyway. So he would get people in the street, in pubs, and he'd go to the local school to try and get people to muck in.
Yeah. This is a film made with no professional actors, is that right?
Well, no, there were a couple.
All right.
In fact, there's a couple of interesting actors in it, which we'll talk about. So, the origin of this, Kevin Brownlow was working as a sort of assistant gopher for a film production company.
Assistant gopher sounds like the lowest of the low.
Well, assistant stroke gopher.
All right.
But his main job was just taking cans of film to other offices and things like that. But of course he was picking up. He wanted to be a director. That was his ambition.
Right.
And the idea came when he was walking along and he saw a black car stop outside a shop. And a guy got out, ran to the shop, and just as he was about to go into the shop, he turned back to the car and shouted something in German.
Yeah.
And then went in. And that got him thinking, what if the Germans had won the war?
Yeah.
Or had taken over Britain?
Yeah.
That was the German idea, and that's what this plot is, basically. We haven't said that yet. The basic idea is Britain in the 1940s has been invaded successfully by the Nazis and is under their occupation.
I think the very beginning of the film, they actually is it Dunkirk, landing goes wrong, and then the Nazis invade?
Yeah. Well, it did. Well, no, Dunkirk was the evacuation.
Right.
You're getting that mixed up with D-Day. Dunkirk is the evacuation. And there was an actual German operation called Operation Sea Lion, which was Hitler's invasion of Britain plan, which never actually happened. It was starting to get set to go in 1940, but it got postponed. It wasn't. The first thing he wanted to do was win the Battle of Britain, win air superiority.
Yeah.
Of course, that didn't happen.
Yes.
And then other things. So it was postponed in September 1940.
Yeah.
It happened here. It's June 1940. Operation Sea Lion has been successful.
Yes. And one thing that happens then is, of course, the German occupation of England. And they say that because of war action in the Urals, most of the German forces removed from England, leaving England in the charge of native but German-controlled forces, which I think is a key point about this, because it's not about, although it is about an occupation, it's really about the internal struggles of the country, which is occupied. So it's about collaboration and resistance, rather than being all the English being on the English side.
Yeah. And that's a key point, and it's probably one of the most fascinating things about this film is that aspect. I should just quickly say, I didn't say at the beginning, there will be spoilers. We're going to talk about every aspect of this film, the plot and everything. So if you want to see it for the first time without spoilers, just pause this podcast, go out and find a copy, watch it, and then come back to us. Yeah, Kevin Brownlow was born in Crowborough.
Right.
Which is only 14 miles from us.
Yeah.
He's a Sussex lad. And I want to say something else I really liked about him. He did a TV series, which was made in 1980, but I think I saw it repeated, called Hollywood. And it's if you're not sure about silent films, a lot of people probably think they're a bit boring, silent, blah, blah, blah. They're absolutely fascinating, actually. And there's many, many amazing silent films. And if you can see Hollywood, I think actually someone's put it on YouTube. Not the nicest way to see it, but it's a fascinating series as well. And he made another one called Unknown Chaplin, which is he got together all Chaplin's outtakes and put it together.
Right.
It's narrated by James Mason. A fascinating stuff. And also got documentaries on video about Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and D.W. Griffith. All worth seeking out. Anyway, back to It Happened Here.
The action actually starts in the West Country of England.
Yes.
And what's happened is that America has finally come into the war, they say.
Yeah.
Has got forces in Ireland, and are supplying the resistance on the west side of England.
That's right. They're doing bombing raids, and also troops. A few troops are landing to help the partisans.
So what the occupying forces have done is said that certain areas which have got a lot of resistance elements in them, they're evacuating, and there's a deadline date whereby anyone not in a German army uniform will be shot on sight.
Yes.
So this is the way that they're going to get the resistance. They're going to clear out everyone but the resistance and the army.
Yes. There's a great opening of the film is a lovely English village, and along comes a British bobby on a bicycle, and then as he cycles by a Panzer tank with Germans around it who are just sort of hanging around it, inspecting the tank, and it's that juxtaposition of very British life, the policeman in his British uniform, and the Nazis. Yeah. Which, of course, we have seen, if you've seen photos of the occupation of the Channel Islands, the only bit of Great Britain to be occupied by the Germans in the Second World War. Yeah. And Brownlow and Mollo, who were the co-directors of the film, reference pictures from that and also of occupied Paris.
Oh, right.
I think the most shocking thing, or the initial surprising thing about this film is its veracity. It just looks so real.
Yes.
Every scene looks like it could be from newsreel footage of an occupying German force. Yeah. That's partly thanks to the amateurishness of it.
Yes, yeah.
It's shot in black and white. It was shot on a variety of different cameras as they could get hold of them. Right. Different stock. The sound was a bit of a hodgepodge, done here and there, and over 8 years, of course, when they had to do the dubbing. Some actors had died, some had moved away, some they couldn't find, others... Kevin Brownlow said the leading lady, who was played by Pauline Jobson, Pauline Murray was...
her character's name.
Yeah, character's name. Well, that's actually her real name, her maiden name.
Oh, right.
Because, well, we'll get to her in a minute. Yeah. But just, she, in one edit, she aged 5 years. Oh. There was one scene when she was 38, and the next one she was 42 or something.
Oh, right. I didn't particularly notice that.
No, I didn't notice it either, but Kevin Brownlow mentioned it, and obviously, that's the kind of period, when you think about that, it took 8 years.
Yeah. So it is worth saying that part of the style of this film, in contrast to the other films we've been talking about, which have been pure stories from start to finish, this has got a lot of what you might call mock documentary footage, like newsreels, and some just scenes of. Like there's a lot of scenes of, as you say, German uniforms in London, for instance. There's a long sequence of various things, which we'll probably come to later. But
Kevin Brownlow met up with Andrew Mollo, who was 16, and the way they met each other was Kevin was looking for
Mr. Brownlow.
Yes, Mr. Brownlow was, I think, in Portobello Road in the market, looking for German uniforms, bits and pieces. And he said to the stallholder, do you know anyone? He said, I think there's a collector. Blah, blah, blah. It turned out to be Andrew Mollo, whose whole family were military collectors. Like, I think his dad was Russian, his mother was English, I think. And they all collected different things. Some of them collected Russian stuff, British stuff. He collected German Nazi stuff. Yeah. Kevin Brownlow went into his room and there was a bust of Hitler, and he was a bit worried at first that he was some sort of closet or not so closet fascist. Yeah. Turned out he wasn't. He was a genuine collector. But he looked at Kevin Brownlow's rushes that he'd shot already and said, that's all wrong. The uniforms are wrong. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. And he brought to it authenticity of all the vehicles, the uniforms. He loaned some of his collection, but they also went to Paris and bought stuff there, sourced stuff. They put an advert in a cinema magazine, and people sent them helmets and things. This was,
58, isn't it?
That's so 12 to 15 years after the
That's one of the things
Second World War.
Watching this, sitting there watching it, part of my mind is thinking about the making of it, and thinking, you really had to have a nerve to walk down an English street in a German uniform, let alone, like, the scenes of a marching band in German uniform. You thought...
And in London.
Yeah.
I mean, he filmed in Trafalgar Square. He filmed in front of the Clock Tower, Big Ben and all that.
Because there'd be a lot of people who would be really emotive about this. One thing I saw recently was a drama about the making of the comedy Dad's Army.
Right.
Which was in the 60s.
Yeah.
And originally they had a title sequence which was stock footage of Nazis walking along. And he said that the people who saw it just were so sort of, not traumatised, but they threw them completely from the comedy that followed.
Right.
They just didn't appreciate it.
Yes.
They thought, it was basically too close.
Yeah.
They thought, I don't want to see any Nazis. And of course some of the actors as well were quite shocked just by the sight of memories of the war being brought back.
Yeah. Kevin Brownlow actually had ex-German soldiers in his cast.
Right.
Because some of them had been prisoners of war and stayed in England or had moved to England. A number of the actors in German uniforms were ex-soldiers. One of them, at least, even an ex-SS officer. That doesn't mean they had Nazi sympathies now. But they spoke German in the film, and that's absolutely authentic. Yeah. There was one point when they were filming in London, and there was a tour of veterans of a German parachute unit, and they saw the filming and couldn't believe it. And they followed the unit around for the rest of the day as part of their tour, became following around these sort of German soldiers. But they were amazed about how authentic it was. And the authenticity is a big part of the film as well. As we say, it just looked like footage.
And considering he had no budget, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it was two
volunteers.
kids.
Everyone's volunteers.
Yeah. But just getting the uniforms. I mean, I suppose they wouldn't have been worth a lot then.
No, that's the thing. They were not in plentiful supply. He had to hunt around for them. But there was one point when Andrew Mollo went down to south of France and said, I've got hundreds of uniforms here.
Oh, right.
And they bought things in Paris and, as I say, from collectors. But the other thing he did, Kevin Brownlow, was he'd make sure the faces were right for the characters.
Oh, really?
And there is one thing I think. He thought, you look like a German soldier.
Yes, yeah.
You look like a refugee. You look like a partisan. And even there's a scene where he films a World War One bit, and he wanted the faces to be sort of that era. Yeah. And it's true, they look like it. I mean, there was one point where he was told, this was later in the sort of 90s, I think, he'd heard that a pro-Nazi propaganda film had been discovered within the collection of some German chap who I don't know who he was, by some Italians, and they had made a documentary and included this footage, and Kevin Brownlow was intrigued. It was said to include some scenes of German soldiers in Britain. So they sent it to him and said this is all authentic footage. And he ended up seeing scenes from his own film. The Italians had included bits of It Happened Here, or somehow that got into this film, this propaganda film. They thought it was real.
Wow.
They thought it was actual Germans in London. Duh. And actually it was his film. He said, would you mind paying me for that? And they just refused and didn't even apologise or anything.
Oh dear.
Typical story of Kevin Brownlow's luck, where he doesn't seem
but
to...
in a way, I hope he took it as a compliment as well.
Yeah, I think I saw him tell that story on a talk, which is on video, actually, on YouTube, and he includes that, and he I think there's a slight bit of pride there. Yeah. And that's one of the great things about the film, but it came from its amateurishness. Yeah. The other thing we should talk about is the acting, because 99% of the actors are amateurs, are friends, are people he got from, dragged out of pubs near where they were filming. And there's some not so good acting in it. Actually, I don't think there's no bits that I think are terrible, because it's real people talking. Yeah. So you get that lovely understated reality. And even let's talk about the lead actress, Pauline Murray. She was married to a guy called Dr. Richard Jobson, who won an amateur film competition about painting, because he was also a painter. He was a doctor in Wales. So that's how Brownlow met him, because I think Dr. Jobson came to London to collect his prize, and they were at this film event. And Kevin Brownlow really liked his film. Yeah. And told him about It Happened Here, and they were interested. And he actually went to Wales, and the doctor's wife was suggested she was actually Irish, and he wasn't sure at first. Anyway, eventually it all happened. Yeah. And she's brilliant in it. She was not happy with her acting, especially when she filmed opposite one of the professionals. She wrote a letter to Brownlow saying, I'm terrible. But it's her understated naturalism that makes the film to some degree.
So she is a district nurse in this area of the West Country that's going to be evacuated, yeah. And so the Germans, or the occupying forces, are evacuating loads of people in trucks, in any sort of vehicle they can get. And there's a few stragglers, including Pauline Murray, who don't fit on the last transport.
Yeah.
There's about, 8 of them, including a child.
Yeah, a couple of
And there's a sort of air warden type policeman who says, "Oh, don't worry, we'll send something.
Yeah.
It'll be all right,"
These are all villagers, by the way, I think, from where Pauline Jobson lived. That's their home village. So they all knew. Yeah. In fact, that's why in the film she's called Pauline, because they all knew her. They just called her Pauline on the screens. Because she was going to be called Allison, I think, originally in the script. Yeah. By the way, he didn't have a script about halfway through the film. He had a plot outline. He started filming, wasn't really sure where it was going, and eventually had to write a script when, at one point, someone offered some financing, but they needed a treatment. So that's what got him to write some form of a script. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Karen.
Yeah, so this small group trying to decide what to do. It's come to the end of the day, which is the deadline for civilians being shot on sight. So she says, "Oh, come on, let's go back to my house and we'll wait." Because I don't think she quite believes that they will send a transport.
No.
They go back to her house, and they're all trying not to bring too much attention to themselves. This is quite a good subtle moment, actually, I think. One of the children says, "Oh, can I use the toilet?" Pauline goes into the kitchen to fetch some food. She comes in, she thinks that the child's still upstairs and calls, "Oh, it's just the door on the left." And then she sees that the child is downstairs. So that's when they realise...
She hears someone upstairs. Yeah.
They realise someone is in her house, which can only mean it's it's resistance, partisans. And she does, "Oh, come on, let's go." Yeah. It's quite good. It's not shock or horror. It's, "Oh, God, let's just get out of this situation."
Yeah, and then, of course, the Germans return, not to evacuation, they're just coming back into the village to occupy it. And the partisans open fire. Yeah. And everyone but Pauline is killed. Yeah. Mostly from partisan machine gun fire.
Yeah, yeah. She runs and catches a train.
Yeah, well, a German hauls her into one of the trucks and gets her away, actually.
Oh, right.
So she gets to the station.
Right, oh, I see. Because it's quite a confused sequence, and I thought she ran to the train. Yeah.
There is a bit where a German pulls her and says, "Come on." And
well, that's good, because that was my one objection. I thought, if there's a train, why didn't they all get on that?
Yeah.
But obviously,
Why didn't they walk to that? Yeah. So she makes it to London. And again, that's another... Kevin Brownlow, he was young, he was an amateur, but he loved film, he'd studied film, and although he learnt a lot during the filming and made lots of mistakes, and that's the best way to learn, of course, there's some fantastic shooting. So when she's on the train, you then see the camera, her eyes are closed, she's sleeping or remembering, and you see the camera glide over the dead bodies back in the village, because that's when you realise they're all dead and she's sort of remembering what happened. But the way that's done as well is good. So yes, she's in London and she's hoping to work as just a district nurse. Part of her backstory is that her husband was killed by the Germans.
Oh yes, yeah.
And she actually says, I just wanted to strangle every German that I saw, but now I just want to get back to normal as quickly as possible.
And this is a theme that runs throughout the film. People are always saying, "Let's just get back to normal."
Yeah.
The main thing I think that the film is about how fascism drags you in and you become part of it without meaning to. Yeah. And so what a lot of the English people, or the occupied people, because she's Irish, say is, "Oh, let's just get things back to normal without worrying about the political side of it. Let's get back to law and order." They just want to focus on getting a livable daily life.
Yeah, and then politically things can change.
Yes, where in fact by that point it's too late. You're embroiled in the whole political system. But
this is the fascinating question, is that in Britain we've got quite a smug attitude to the fact we won the war. We're part of the Allies that won the war. We beat Germany. Yeah. We can look down on them as being weak-minded, perhaps, for falling for this Hitler chap. Yeah. But we wouldn't do something like that. And I think that is part of the crux of this film, is that, the title is "It Happened Here."
Yes.
It can happen there, it happened here. In fact, there was a 1935 novel called "It Can't Happen Here." And I don't know if he was aware of that. I assume it happened here. It seems like a reference to that. Yeah. Brownlow's saying,
it happened anywhere.
It happened here. It happened even in Britain. Yeah. If it can happen to the Germans, it can happen here. And I think, getting a bit political now, this is fascinating in today's age, because look at someone like Donald Trump in the States, who, I imagine him being president, what a nightmare. he holds rallies, which is an emotive word when you're talking about Hitler, but they are called rallies, of course, but you don't have that connotation so much these days.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about Hitler and fascists, and you mention the word rally, a different meaning comes into it. And there's been events recently where Muslims have turned up to protest, and they've been heckled, shouted down, and thrown out. And this is exactly what happened in the 1930s with the British Fascist Party. They'd have rallies under Oswald Mosley, who features in this film, not an actual person, but as a backdrop. He looms large, let's say.
Yeah.
And if people went along dissenters, they were thrown out. They were beaten down. They weren't allowed to talk. Trump probably sees himself as a great American freedom, blah, blah, blah. He's not. He's the same as the fascists.
Yeah.
It's the same thing happening. They have got extreme views.
Yeah.
And that's what this film...
And they'll back them up by extreme methods.
You think you're doing the right thing. So it happened to the Germans. They came out of the First World War. They felt they'd been hard done by. Here comes this Hitler guy. Let me have the authority and I'll fix things. And he did start to fix things, obviously under a pretty horrible dictatorship. But still, for those who were the right race, things got better.
Yeah.
But that's not justice.
And because because the situation at the time was a great deal of social unrest and poverty and difficulty in people's day-to-day lives, and he was probably, his main appeal to most of them was the same as in this film: get things back to normal, restore law and order. And you think, just if we can get to that, then we can sort out the rest.
Exactly.
But by that point, you've got a fascist government.
I think that's why it happened here is very relevant today when you look at someone like Donald Trump, who thinks that he's doing a good thing, a right thing, and but when you look at them, they're hateful people. They've got hateful ideas, but they're not noticing. I don't think
No.
If you look at someone like Britain First, for instance, they're all, we're patriotic, Great Britain, look, we won the war, blah, blah, blah. But actually, they're got more in common with the Nazis, who they, are so proud we won the war against. Anyway, perhaps we're getting a bit too political, but this is a very political film.
Yes,
that was interesting that Kevin Brownlow didn't want it to be a political film at first. It was just an idea of exploring what would it be like, and he actually had a discussion with a young communist who started saying, you can't make a film that has no opinion. That's the whole thing about art, because Kevin Brownlow was saying, no, I just want to be an observer. I just want to point the camera and do the facts. And he said, you can't. And Kevin Brownlow actually thought he had a point.
Right.
That art has to have a point of view of some kind.
Well, in a way, that's what the film's about, isn't it? Saying you can't just live your life. At some point, you are going to have take a political point of view.
Yes, at first they came for and I didn't do anything, and then they came for and I didn't do anything. And then eventually they come for you, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, so there's so much we could talk about on this subject, because it permeates the film, but let's move on with the plot a bit.
So Pauline gets to London, where she's been given a, what's the word? Not a birth. Billet, that's it, with a friend who did make it out. Yeah, who did make it, and who obviously didn't witness the massacre that Pauline witnessed.
Yes. She hadn't heard what happened to the last few. I just want to say, while she's walking from the train station to her accommodation, she walks through bombed-out London, which, of course, there were a lot of bomb sites still in London. Yeah. Which gives it authenticity again. Yeah. There's a bit where she comes across a bit that's sectioned off with barbed wire, an area for Jews. So you've got that going on as well. Yeah. So she wants to set herself up as a district nurse, which is, again, getting things back to normal. Yes. She talks about getting the country back on its feet again. But there's this organisation called Immediate Action Organisation, which seems to be taking on people like nurses and training them to be pretty much like, I guess, Hitler's brown shirts. It's basically a political organisation, but it's also organises nurses and so on. Yeah. So it seems like the best way for her to make use of her talents would be to join this. Well, she doesn't want to be political, as you said. She just wants to be a nurse. But, the Immediate Action Group are the services arm of the fascists. Right, yeah. Because the Nazis are in control. Yeah. And this was actually part of the plan of the real Operation Sea Lion. Oh, right. Was the Nazis would be in control, but they used the British fascists to sort of run things on the local level. Right. And they actually wanted Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British Union of Fascists, they had him in their sights.
as
to run things, pretty much. With his black shirts, he had the black shirts, and she doesn't want to join them, but she finds she's got no choice because they really want nurses. She's very useful with that skill.
She goes to an employment office where, of course, they're glad to find that she's got qualifications. She's put into an interview with an officer who gets, when she says, I don't want to do anything political, he gets quite riled up and gives her a lecture on, this is the only way to be a nurse, this is the only way to get the country back on its feet, and so on.
Now, you want to continue nursing. I take it that you have no objection to joining this organisation.
Well, I'd prefer ordinary nursing.
No such thing in London. You either nurse with us, or you sit at home nursing an empty stomach. There's no two ways about it. You can't object. Now let's see if we can. No, you're clear. You're not a Jew, communist, anarchist, Freemason. You're definitely in. Now, there is a refresher course. You'll have to learn to look after yourself.
I'm sorry. I don't want to join any organisation.
Look, this isn't 1937. Things have changed. The point is this. The only way to combat the underground movement and all the other subversive elements that make our life a misery is to be better organised than they are. We just can't have lots of splendid people like you spread all over the country, working under their own steam. If we can get them all together, working towards one end, we'll soon get the old country back on its feet again.
But what if you don't agree with that one end?
Look, let's get the country back on its feet again. Then we'll talk about that.
She walks in and there's a portrait of Oswald Mosley and a portrait of Hitler on the wall, which she gives a sly glance to. Brownlow and Mollo went to an actual rally by Oswald Mosley in the 50s, or maybe early 60s, I don't know. He'd been, before the war, he set up the British Union of Fascists and did loads of rallies and had some success, but as Hitler's power grew and it became apparent what he was, they lost a fair amount of support, but they were still quite strong. Until the war started, then Mosley was interned, and then after the war, he actually moved to France and lived there. But he did try to make a political comeback in the 50s, I think, the late 50s, and that's when Brownlow went to see him. And he actually asked Mosley a question about something about, his attitude towards Jews. And they were sort of shouted down and booed, thinking about these recent Trump rallies again, similar sort of thing. So, that's interesting. The Nazis had a list of people who they wanted to help them in the event of who they would trust with positions of power, and also a list of people that they would exterminate.
So before the interview is over, the employment interview, it seems very British. He says, it's dinner time, why don't we go for a drink?
Yes.
Because he's quite... This is the thing about a few of the official fascist figures in this. They're quite sort of jolly British people. And, obviously that was just their manner at the time.
Well, some of the characters in those positions are real fascists who believe in the cause. Others, I think, like this recruitment officer, he's certainly supporting it, but I don't think he's an enthusiastic fascist. He's got the pictures on the wall. He thinks it's the best way to get back to normal and is happy to engage in the politics of it. Pauline doesn't want to do the politics, just wants to stay out of it, but she finds she's got no choice.
In fact, this moment coming up is the thing that actually makes her decide. So they go, she and this IA officer go to a pub. He's jostled by a drunk bloke who I think was wearing this drunk bloke seemed to be wearing a top which made me think of soldier's uniform.
Right. I think one of them the older men had some medals as well, maybe from the First World War probably.
So I wonder if he's supposed to be like, an ex-soldier defeated and so on, who might have a grudge against the fascists anyway, but... What happens next is they get into a fight and suddenly there's a full-out riot going on. So Pauline gets the police, comes back, breaks it up, but now she's pretty much decided that the country needs law and order. And the only people offering law and order are the immediate action organisation.
Sounds like something out of 1984 as well, doesn't it? Which, I thought that when watching the film, and then later read an interview with Kevin Brownlow where he really liked those. 1984 was one of his favourite books at the time.
So she goes to another interview now with a female recruitment officer. And there's this brilliant point where Pauline Murray is explaining, she says, I've decided that I'm going to be part of this organisation, I've decided this. And the woman says, we don't accept your decisions, you accept ours. Does it so casually, but it's so much a sign of what she's really dealing with.
What I like about the person who's playing that role is she's very British. And when she says that line about, you don't decide, it sounds slightly alien to her character. And I think that's probably because she's amateur and saying this line. But actually, again, it's perfect for the film because there's this fascism being... Everyone's got to go along with it.
Yes, yeah.
It's that sort of thing that you had in East Germany where if you don't go along with it, your neighbour's going to tell on you and you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So whether you believe it or not, if you want to survive, you kind of have to go along with it. Or you take the other route of becoming a partisan resistance fighter.
Yeah.
Which is a possibility, but a lot more dangerous, of course. And probably most people... You can't say... This is the thing. You can't say what you do in the situation until you've been in it.
Yeah.
And everyone would like to think they'd be a hero and defy it. But the reality is 95% of people would go along with it for their own survival.
Yeah.
There's various breaking points, of course.
Yeah.
But I just think that's perfect when she says those lines. There's this little sort of Britishness underneath it that feels a bit like she shouldn't be saying it. I don't know.
Yes, it's a good point.
Again, it's the amateurishness of the film being perfect for this, for the context.
Yes, yeah. So what follows is Pauline's training. She said at some point, I think it's almost immediately before this, that she doesn't think it's going to be a military organisation. But almost immediately you see it. She's being trained in a military way.
Yeah.
Getting on an ambulance.
I think that's the funny thing, isn't it? Because as soon as she says that line, or she worries that it's going to be too military, something like that. There's this cup stamped down, and this
army sergeant type,
shouts out, "Get on the ambulance!" And they've got to run. And
there's quite a good sequence of. I mean, there's various bits of her being trained, but like the marching sequences. There's 3 of them. One where she's sort of part of everyone else marching. And in the end, she's at the front of the people marching, telling them to march.
I didn't notice that.
And there's also firing a gun. There's one point where she's very unsure. She fires it and looks away. Yeah. And at the end, a few sequences later, she's does six shots, all on target. I'm sure.
So that's a good little scene. And then at the end, she's trained. She's starting to get into service and. There's another great scene. She gets on the bus.
Yes, yeah.
She's all in her uniform, which is black.
Yeah.
It's got the little immediate action flash, a sort of a lightning bolt, which is also the actual insignia of the real British Union of Fascists.
Right.
So it's totally authentic. And she looks down at her lovely shiny shoes.
Yeah.
And then she slowly looks up and sees the shoes of the women sitting opposite her, all scuffed and old. And they're looking at her in her uniform. She suddenly realises...
Yeah. They're looking at her with contempt.
Yeah.
Because she's gone over. This is one of those points where she's
one of them.
She's sort of brought up against the consequences of her decision.
Yeah.
I mean, the great thing about this film is at every point you can see that she's making a reasonable decision.
Yeah. Yes.
But she is slowly drawn into the wrong overall decision.
That's a very good point.
But this brings... I mean, this is one of these things where it's difficult to imagine how he could have got people to act it so well. I mean, because the look is so... It's not a line, it's just a look of contempt. And it's so British. That sort of contempt with that.
Yeah.
But someone spills... Getting off the bus, someone spills something on her.
Yeah.
And she's annoyed, she's trying to wipe it off. And someone gives her something to wipe it off with, which is the first thing anyone has done on the bus, which is nice to her. And she realises what they've given her is a copy of the fascist newspaper, which I think is a brilliant... she thinks, is that a dig?
Yeah.
I think it's brilliant.
Perfect.
But she's on her way to visit an old friend.
That's right.
Dr. Fletcher.
Yes.
Who has been ousted from his house. He's now in the basement of what was his house.
Yeah, his house is occupied by a young, smart, slick chap in a fascist's uniform.
Yes.
Who says, yes, he's downstairs, and... He seems to be quite nice. In fact, Dr. Fletcher even says he's a nice chap.
Yeah. I mean, as we know that they're desperate for nurses, presumably they're also desperate for doctors, so it seems quite significant that he's being treated badly, considering he's a doctor.
He's still practising, but down in the basement.
So, I mean, there's a sort of sequence of a few scenes with him, and that's really what the main thrust of the film is for the next few, even though we get some... I mean, interspersed in the next bit, there's some talks from genuine fascists.
Can I just talk about Dr. Fletcher a minute? He was a professional actor, Sebastian Shaw.
I wondered, because when you said that there were professional actors, he was the one I thought of.
Yeah, and it was the scenes with him that Pauline suddenly lost some of her confidence and said, I look terrible in front of him. And the person playing his wife, Fiona Leland, who I don't think was a professional actor. Sebastian Shaw, he was did very well in films before the war.
Right.
He was a young, good-looking, sort of leading man type, earning quite a lot of money from his films. Then the war happened. He joined the RAF, and when the war ended and he got back, he kind of had to start his career again.
Oh, right.
But he was still, had a career as an actor and did very well. And in fact, when Brownlow and Mollo were thinking, who can we get to play the Doctor? So it'd be great if we could get a professional actor. And they opened up Spotlight, and it opened up at Sebastian Shaw's page, and they said, if only we could get someone like him. And Andrew Mollo said, well, why don't we? And Kevin Brownlow said, no, we can't. He said, yeah, do it. So they phoned up his agent, and he agreed to do it for a nominal fee.
Oh, right.
Now, Sebastian Shaw's later career is very interesting because he played the unmasked Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi.
Really?
If you look at his eyes, knowing that, when you look at him, you'll recognise him.
Oh, wow.
His eyes, he's the same guy. And he said he got more fan mail for that part than in anything else he'd done in his career.
Yeah.
He started his career playing in a 1929 play in New York called Rope's End, which was made into Rope by Alfred Hitchcock. Yeah. So Sebastian Shaw was the professional actor of the...
right.
There were a couple of other actors, career actors as well, who I don't really know so well.
Yeah.
But just talking about Star Wars, they eventually got a cinematographer called Peter Shisky. Say that carefully. I'm probably mispronouncing it. Whose father was a cinematographer as well. Worked on a lot of films. His father was, I think, called Wolfgang Shisky, and he worked on a lot of films. But what of interest to us, perhaps, is The Vengeance of She, Hammer's sort of sequel to their 1965 version of She with Ursula Andress. And he also worked on Get Carter.
Oh, right.
His son Peter. This was kind of his first film, really, working in that capacity. He later worked on the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Krull, and was David Cronenberg's main cameraman for his later career.
Oh, right.
From sort of 1980s onwards. But his big one was The Empire Strikes Back. He was on The Empire Strikes Back.
Wow.
So some interesting people later on. When Pauline visits the Doctor, she visits him. She's still got her coat on, so they don't see that she's in the uniform of an immediate action.
Yeah.
Which the Doctor amusingly says, well, actually it's in a later scene, but he says, what's that group? I'm skipping ahead here. What's that group? They sound something like a laxative.
Immediate action.
Being a doctor, you probably have that. And then, just as she's taking her coat off, this is the second scene with them, and he sees their...
I think it's done really well. First she visits them, and she brings them some packages of food.
Yeah.
Which might indicate to them that she's, slightly doing better off politically than them.
Yeah.
She said then she's just going to visit them again. Or maybe
she's just come from the country, so they might think it's that and be quite innocent about it.
So she visits again, and the Doctor immediately gets her to help him do up a bed. Yeah. So she's still got her coat on.
They're packing, aren't they, it seems.
And they're obviously going to ask her something. And they're assuming, obviously, because they're saying, we need your help, because she's a nurse. And it turns out that they've got a partisan who is ill. And they're trying to care for him, obviously, but they're also trying to keep him quiet. And they're going to ask for her help. Yeah. Because they know her, they're pretty sure that she wouldn't be a fascist. Yeah. And they just start to ask her when she takes off her coat. I think it's done really well.
Yeah.
And they see the flash on her arm.
His face falls, doesn't it? He goes, oh.
Yeah.
Because it's a friend of theirs, and he's just revealed... Well, he hasn't told her about the partisan they're hiding. Yeah. But he's revealed his political
because he's been bad-mouthing the fascists.
Not that she's against that, because he did that earlier as well.
But significantly, she doesn't say, I would never tell.
No.
Because what happens next is that the bloke...
She tries to persuade them to hand him in.
Yeah, the partisan is too ill, and he calls out because he's in a fever. And she says to them... So she finds out they've got a partisan there. She says, do you know what the penalty is for harbouring a partisan? She doesn't say, I would never tell... Which I think, if that was me, I'd say, don't worry, I'm not going to tell. But but she does try and help.
Yes, to get some morphia.
Yeah,
that's also the bit where the Doctor talks about fascism. Yeah, she's saying that's a really interesting bit, and another aspect of the film. He says that the Nazis are terrible. She says, yes, I know the Nazis are terrible, but don't whitewash the partisans.
Yes,
they killed all my friends. So yes, the Nazis are bad. She's saying the partisans are just as bad.
Yeah,
that's not the solution necessarily. He then says, well, perhaps to fight fascism, you need a bit of fascism.
Yeah.
He says, once fascism surfaces in us, it's very difficult to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And that's what you said earlier.
Well, he says it's like a disease.
Yeah.
Once a disease is taking place, you've got to attack it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he talks about inoculation, interestingly, because where you use part of the disease to fight that disease.
Yes, yeah.
We have skipped ahead a bit there, and I want to go back to a bit where I think it's possibly before she visits the doctor. It might be just after, where they go to the cinema and they see Mirror on the World newsreel. In fact, they're going to see a film. They go to the Astoria.
Right.
And it says Hans Albers in Answer Yes Tomorrow. And Answer Yes Tomorrow, I think, is a fictitious thing. I couldn't find anything about that. Hans Albers was a very famous... He was the biggest film star in Germany during the war.
Oh, right.
He wasn't really a Nazi himself. He was one of those get-by kind of people. He actually had a Jewish girlfriend who escaped to Britain, and they were reunited after the war.
Oh, right.
But he was a massive star. They sort of... I think they said he was equivalent to sort of Germany's John Wayne sort of thing. So anyway, they're going to see this film, but there's probably one of the centerpieces of It Happened Here is the newsreel, Mirror on the World. And Kevin Brownlow has done completely perfect newsreel style. There's jump cuts, the camera moves like it, and he actually got a famous wartime BBC newsreel narrator to do the narration, so that's totally authentic as well.
Because I did hear that there is no stock footage used in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is amazing.
And it seems incredible. During the newsreel, there's a bit where he says, this is the only known footage of the Christmas truce football game in World War One. And of course, he did it himself. Yeah. And a BBC floor manager lent him a 1922 hand-cranked camera.
Oh, really?
And so he used an actual, well, okay, a bit later than the First World War, but the camera they used at the time to film that. So you get the hand-cranked feel. And that's why it looks so authentic.
Yes.
He changed the camera, through a stroke of luck. And he wanted the faces to be right. So they were wearing false moustaches. They had authentic uniforms. Yeah. The weather when they filmed it was atrocious. He couldn't actually see through his glasses or the viewfinder of the camera, and just sort of pointed it in the right direction. Yeah. But again, probably lending to the authenticity. Yes, yeah. All the soldiers had the Queen Mary gift tins that were given to all soldiers in the First World War. Oh, you didn't see them in the film, but it was part of... they all felt as though they'd got this Christmas gift. Yeah. But that whole newsreel is brilliant, and it explains... It's pure propaganda from the German point of view, explains how the British and the Germans were brothers, which is something that Hitler actually thought. He was very disappointed that Britain came to the war against him. And so they point to this football match on the Flanders about the true relationship coming through there. Then they blame the Jews for ruining everything. And in fact, I think they actually say the Second World War, the bombing, that was the fruits of Jewish control, is the phrase I think they use. Complete propaganda. But that explains, and now we're brothers again, and there's all the fascist party, the immediate action, and the Germans marching together. But it's a brilliant sequence. It's absolutely brilliant, because that's where you get a lot of the Germans in London. There's medleys of those, not medleys, what are they called?
Montages.
Montages of those scenes earlier as well, and they're brilliant. You get Nazis walking out of the Midland Bank.
Yes.
They're on embankment looking at the girls as they walk by with the Houses of Parliament in the background. They're in Trafalgar Square getting cups of coffee from a mobile tea van. Yeah. And the people around them, they're getting their... Oh, there's an interesting scene where what looks like some, I don't know what they are, Mongolian troops, like whatever they are, they're getting their shoes shined. Yeah. And the shoe shiner is obviously an authentic London shoe shiner of the period. Yeah. And also a coffee seller or tea seller. Yeah. And there's these people in German uniforms buying stuff from them. And they're not actors, they're...
This made me think of some... this was... the film is 1964, isn't it?
Yeah, that's when it ended, That's when it came out, anyway.
Also in 1964 or 5 was, as is slightly parallel, Doctor Who and the Dalek Invasion of Earth.
Oh, right.
And the famous scene on that is, of course, the Daleks coming across London Bridge, or one of the bridges in London, outside the Houses of Parliament, anyway. And that made me think that it's quite characteristic of British
Westminster
films.
Bridge, probably.
Westminster Bridge, British films about invasions, whether from alien invasions or German invasions, that have them parading around in recognisable landmarks.
Yeah.
Whereas in American films, if you think of the sort of alien invasion films of America, they tend to have them over their cities blowing up their main landmarks. That seems to be the thing that Americans make them think that's an invasion. Whereas British, it's actually seeing someone walking down
Right.
a recognisable street.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes.
So, but I the Daleks thing is, because of course Daleks are basically Nazis.
Yeah.
It shows that this sort of imagery was floating around in other people's heads, trying to get itself known. You know?
Yeah. Anyway, so you were talking about some of there's 3 or 4 scenes where fascists make speeches to the immediate action recruits.
Yeah.
There's an early one with a very posh, accented guy talking about National Socialism.
New philosophy.
Yeah, and he's pretty good, actually. And he was actually a teacher, Miles Halliwell, and he was the lead in Kevin Brownlow's other film that he made in the 70s, Winstanley.
Oh, right.
Which I think was set during the Civil War or something, or just after it, the English Civil War. Now, other cast members who did some of those speeches were genuine fascists.
Yes.
And one of the key scenes in the film, another key scene, I keep saying this is a key scene, is where they're in a sort of a lounge tea room.
Yeah.
And there's 2 fascists, and there's various recruits, and they're asking them questions about fascism, and they're sounding off. And it's very authentic, the reason being because the 2 people who are answering the questions, the first time I saw this, I thought, oh, they're good. The second time, I knew that they were actual fascists. They believed what they were saying. This was a totally natural scene. They were asked questions. They answered what they believed.
Yeah.
And it sends a chill up your spine because it's real. And this was a problem later for Kevin Brownlow and Andrew Mollo, because the film eventually had some success and got picked up by United Artists for distribution. But they eventually decided that scene had to go because there were a lot of claims of anti-Semitism, saying you're promoting Nazism, you're anti-Semitic. Kevin Brownlow couldn't believe it because he said, no, these people are condemning themselves by what they say. Can't you see that? Yeah. And he was dumbfounded that people couldn't see that they thought it was promoting it. It's that thing again where people get mixed up between commenting on something rather than proposing it.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think you have to it takes a slight intellectual dimness, not necessarily non-intelligent people at all, but to maybe not recognise it, but to not allow that. I think you've got to allow these things to be said, and to have them coming from actual fascists. Most people see that and are horrified by it, because I kind of think generally people are good. It's very difficult. You hear of people doing bad things and you think, well, maybe there was this circumstance, or maybe we're not quite getting the truth. Then you see people saying things like, if I had a child who was deformed in some way, yes, I'd euthanize it. Yeah. You know, absolutely, cut it out. Dead meat, he says. This is actual words. Or put the Jews on Madagascar, which was the sort of 1950s version of, he probably... I mean, his name was Frank Bennett, the one with the moustache, who actually looked a bit like Hitler, didn't he? And he was a Nazi, an actual Nazi, living in the 1950s, 60s Britain.
Right.
So by then, it was, it wasn't concentration camps for the Jews, it was put them on Madagascar. He's asked, what if you're Jewish? And he said, well, I'd probably cut my neck to get that blood out.
Yes.
I mean, that's real. Yeah. And so you might think good of people, but to see the genuine thing makes you realise how serious they are and what a danger it is. So that's why I think that scene's important, and it was absolutely a mistake for Jewish groups and other people who were very uncomfortable with it, and rightly so. Yeah. But to cut it out is the wrong thing. Censorship is not the answer. Yeah. And thankfully now it's back in the film, and you can be shocked by it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be very interested to know your reaction to euthanasia.
It's a surgical operation, getting rid of useless matter, useless tissue. Any doctor does it 10 times a day, if it's necessary.
If you had a small child who contracted some disease that left him paralyzed, as well he might, would he then be just waste tissue to be got rid of?
Exactly.
Certainly.
No member is in the position of privilege to protect a useless person. A person is useless because he's useless, not because he happens to be related to somebody who's useful.
Without the existence of such a law, I would want to take that law into my own hands anyway.
But a fantastic scene because of its genuineness. And that's this Frank Bennett chap gets a scene later where he's talking at the funeral.
Yeah.
And that's where you're thinking, goodness me, it's Hitler.
Yeah.
He's shouting.
Yes.
And again, the first time I saw it, I thought, wow, great acting. And then when you see it and know that he's a real Nazi and he believes what he's saying, he's getting the chance to do his Hitler speech.
Yes.
The way Kevin Brownlow met him was Frank Bennett borrowed a Nazi flag from Andrew Mollo, who was known as a collector.
Right.
And he was using it for a centrepiece of a party. So Kevin Brownlow and Andrew Mollo were invited to the party because of that connection, went. And all these fascists started turning up, and they realised it wasn't a fancy dress or anything. It was a party of real fascists. That's how they got involved in the film, because they thought, wow, these views are incredible.
Yeah.
We've got to have it in the film. So there was him. And it's interesting, isn't it? There's the guy with the beard is the other bloke talking.
Yeah.
He's even more unnerving, because whereas Frank Bennett is quite forthright in his views, the other guy's very English and sort of, well, you see, you know, I mean, I would absolutely kill my own child.
His tone is utterly reasonable, whereas what he's saying is
so, wow.
I think the whole thing about that is that usually we watch a film, we don't engage our brains, and everything just washes over you. And this is one of those moments where you suddenly wake up thinking, what am I listening to? And if you use your brain, you think, what are these characters saying? Not what are the films saying, what are these characters saying? And then you judge them.
Yeah.
Judge them, not the film. But it's too easy to just disengage your brain.
Yeah. At the funeral, which I think is a brilliant scene just because of that speech he makes and knowing he's real. Apparently one of the extras found it too uncomfortable, took off his uniform and ran off.
Yeah.
But they sing a song at the end in English, but that was the Horst Wessel, which was the Nazi Party anthem. But they translated it into English for this scene. And an interesting thing is, years later, Kevin Brownlow got contacted and told that song was still in copyright. And he said, but the guy who wrote it is dead. He actually got shot. He got assassinated during the war. And he had to pay something like 360 quid or something. So years later, he had to pay. Another bit of bad luck. He just
probably to the fascist party as well.
Oh, no, I don't know. Yeah. Oh, an odd one to collect money on.
Yes.
So let's move on with the plot a bit.
Yeah. She tries to get some morphia to help this partisan.
Yeah.
She goes to someone who's been her friend so far.
Yeah.
It seems a bit simple, but
it seems incredibly simple, because she says, don't tell anyone. And she gets up and goes and tells her boss that someone needs some morphia.
Yeah. And she
creeps
says,
out.
who is it? Why do they need it? I don't know. But basically, her goose is cooked. It shows, it comes on the line later saying, the party demands your loyalty, and that's above your loyalty to friends.
Yeah.
And this is a sign of that. You know, you can't trust anyone. It's only the party you can trust, as it were.
So I think, and then there's the funeral, and then she goes to visit her doctor friend and discovers
slightly late
that they are being taken away by Nazis.
I mean, she says she tried to get there before the funeral, but she can't. So if she had, she would have been caught there.
Yes, that's
true. So in a way, she's saved by circumstances.
Yeah, but also I imagine the doctor and his family may have assumed that she was the one who ratted on them.
Yes,
when actually it was almost certainly the neighbour, because we see him being suspicious. So they get taken away to some unknown fate.
She's summoned before an IAO officer.
Yeah.
Who says, basically, because you're trained as a nurse, that's the only thing that's valuable about you now, because you've betrayed. You've betrayed the party, you've betrayed the country, the English people. Doesn't matter about your friends, you've betrayed us. So the only thing that's worthwhile about her now is her training, so they're going to use that.
Yeah.
And she's going to be transferred to a rehabilitation centre.
Yeah.
Which, as soon as hearing that, I thought, I know what that's going to be. But, of course, she doesn't know that, because she hasn't been through the...
Well, she gets sent to this beautiful, idyllic countryside hospital. And it is beautiful. There's birds singing, it's quiet, it seems quite nice, actually. And the nurses are there, and she is able to get out of the old uniform. Her black uniform and into a regular nurse's uniform.
Yeah. She's given a room. She says, I always think as long as your room's all right, everything's going to be all right. Which is one of those moments you think, oh no, what's coming?
He's picked up from the station by the caretaker of the hospital, who's this old bloke, who was played by an actor, but he couldn't drive, and they actually taught him to drive that morning. So at the hospital, their first thing is they've got a load of Polish workers coming in who have got TB.
Yeah.
And as far as she knows, they're going to be caring for them.
Yeah. She does say, where are the thermometers?
Yeah.
Which is, they're making up beds. And you say, don't worry about that. No, the other nurse first asks, have you been told everything about this place? And she says, most of it. Then she says, "Where are the thermometers?" And the other nurse says, "Oh, you haven't been told everything about this place.
Don't worry. Don't worry about it."
Yeah.
So in come these Poles, maybe about 12, 15, including a young boy, and they're told to get out of their clothes and into their pyjamas.
Yeah.
Interestingly, striped pyjamas that are slightly reminiscent of concentration camp uniforms. And perhaps a sign is that she's told to get a big basket to put all the clothes in. So they're not kept by their bed, they're not kept separate, they're all put in a big basket.
Yeah.
So the clues are mounting up.
Yeah.
And then they're told they're going to be inoculated against
Infectious diseases.
Infectious diseases. There's one of the doctors there who's obviously German, isn't he?
Yeah.
Who seems to have what I think is a German accent. He's not the head, he's the assistant. It turns out the next morning she's...
I think it's significant that they inoculate, quotes there, some of the, I was going to call them prisoners, but they're not.
The workers.
The workers. And then our heroine herself has to continue. So she does some of the injections.
Including the boy.
Yes.
There's a nice scene, where the matron is rummaging through the store and finds a couple of teddies.
Yeah.
One of them's a gollywog.
Yes.
And gives them to the little boy to play with.
Yeah, just to comfort him.
Yeah. You're watching this slightly unnerved, thinking, is this what I think it is?
Yeah. So the key thing is she has actually given this injection to some of the people there.
And another scene that, again, is slightly, oh my God, is where one of the Poles, the clothes are being taken away. He says, wait, and he's hidden a piece of bread that he puts under his pillow.
Yeah. At the end of that, she's whacked. She goes to bed, wakes up the next morning a little bit late, and thinks, I better get onto the ward quickly. Goes there, all the beds are empty. Mm-hmm. She walks around, she can't find anyone. She sees some people in the distance who've been working in the ground, so she follows them, walks along until she finds 12 freshly dug graves, and then she realises just what's been going on.
Now this mirrors an actual early Nazi policy from the 30s, which became known as the Action T4 program, where they would start to get rid of the, quotes, undesirables. Yeah. And they started with children. They would euthanize children who had something wrong with them, whether they were disabled or had mental problems of some kind. It was called the Action T4 program, and it was carried out in hospitals, and they would do exactly as they did here. There was even, Kevin Brownlow had read that the nurses were really kind to the patients. They would even give the children toys, but of course what they were doing was killing them. Yeah. And throughout, this eventually spread to adults. And of course, these are the first step towards getting bold enough to have concentration camps where you're just killing on a mass industrial scale. But 70,000 people were killed through this Action T4 program, euthanized. Yeah. There were German doctors who managed to save people. So there was, as much as you can do under a system where you don't want your family shot or whatever. But some of the phrases they use, because she's again on the train, she complains about this. Yes. She obviously refuses to do it. Yeah. And you see she's on the train, and then again there's a flashback where all the staff are making excuses for it. Yeah.
How do you think I feel? Do you think I like it here? What's the alternative? I can't leave, I've no other job to go to. And if we refuse to carry on, they'd send us all to concentration camps. Either way, they're going to die. Isn't it kinder for them to die this way?
You see, we've always been a nursing home. We've always treated TB cases. So the authorities find it convenient that we should appear to carry on as before. The patients, the incurable ones, have to go. So we just do our best to see them through their last hours as humanely as possible.
Then why did you join that organization in the first place? When you joined that, you accepted National Socialism, and you accepted every method it employs to achieve its aims. You can't ignore the basic issue. We're involved in a great cleansing operation, wiping out disease, medical, political, racial. We don't enjoy this charade any more than you do. But we find that kindliness allays suspicion, makes disposal easier. You see, we're like soldiers at the front. They can't betray their country by deserting their post, and nor can we.
I think some of these phrases from earlier, but from the fascists talking, because that one is asked the question about euthanasia. Would you euthanize your own kid if there was something wrong with it? He says, absolutely, without a doubt. It's useless meat. Other things that are used are human dross or passengers. Oh, useless eaters.
Yeah,
they're useless eaters.
Yeah, that's a...
Oh, God. So, yeah, she's handcuffed to a Nazi officer, taken on a train. And then
this is the low point in her story, really, where she started... just wanting to be a nurse, just wanting to get by, So she joins the IAAF, and suddenly she is one of the murderers. You know. She didn't want to be, and at no point did she decide to be, but she is.
Yeah, her get out is sort of, thankfully, the train is ambushed by partisans, so she ends up as a prisoner. Yeah, along with some of the Germans, but they need nurses as well. Yes. Thankfully, so.
And she takes off her armband and goes to just help. I mean, all the way through the film, she just wants to use her skill to help people. But because she didn't take a definite political stance, I suppose that's the point.
There's a scene where she's in the tea rooms back in London, and she just wants to read a magazine, and every magazine is military, and then she finally finds one that looks like a woman's magazine. She opens up, and it's got, again, Hitler in and stuff. The radio is just military news, military speeches, marching music. Her friend asks her to turn it off, or to change the channel, but gets put back on. Yeah. And then when she's looking after the partisans in hospital, again, the partisans have got their own, again, it's the radio, it's propaganda. Yes. It's how brilliantly they're doing. Yeah. You can't escape it. And the film ends with a load of German prisoners being taken to a field and shot. It's basically as it started, the Germans killing a load of villagers, which is shocking. I mean, that's a very early scene, including children. And this goes back to Pauline's phrase, don't whitewash the partisans. They're doing the same. They're killing. Yeah. Because the Germans come out of the village under a white flag. So, the Geneva Convention, I guess it never got made, but...
Oh, yes.
There isn't one. But the sort of looking after prisoners of war didn't happen, obviously. So that's the last scene, isn't it?
Well, it's an excellent film, I think.
Yeah, it was criticised for being anti-Semitic. Other people hated the fact, saying that the British people
would never
do that and collaborate. And I think, as we said, that's the point of the film. Yeah. It happened there, it can happen here. It got made thanks to the director Tony Richardson. I think it was Tony Richardson.
Right, yeah.
Directed Tom Jones. And Andrew Mollo was working for a film company and was working on Tom Jones. He later went on to become a kind of historical advisor specialising in uniforms and worked on The Eagle Has Landed, which we're going to be talking about. Which has parallels to this film in a way, in which you've got the Nazis in an English setting, but perhaps we'll talk about that more with The Eagle Has Landed. Andrew Mollo was also an advisor on The Pianist, Downfall, which we're also going to be talking about.
Oh, right.
And also Dr. Zhivago.
Yes, with David Lean, yes.
And he was a designer. He designed the whole first series of Sharp and some of Hornblower and wrote several books on military uniforms. But another connection... Oh, yeah. I was saying Tony Richardson, director of Tom Jones, so I think he won an Oscar for that.
Right.
He gave them something like £3,000, which suddenly made sure they could finish the film. Yeah. Another guy who helped was some small director called Stanley Kubrick.
Really?
Who Kevin Brownlow met at a film event. Yeah. And he gave them his spare stock from Dr. Strangelove. Sort of the end, the cut-offs and things. So he had some nice 35mm film he could shoot with. And another person who, interestingly, saw the film was Leni Riefenstahl.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the Nazi filmmaker. But she couldn't watch it. She started watching it, and it was too real. She said she saw... Kevin Brownlow was quite disappointed that she didn't watch the whole film. But it's an interesting concept, what would have happened if the Germans had won the war. I mean, because, it could have happened. Yeah. Have you ever read Fatherland by Robert Harris?
Yes.
Yeah, that's... It doesn't take place in England, it takes place in Germany. But it's, again, that thinking. And was Amazon Television did a series recently called The Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, based on Philip K. Dick book.
Right.
I've read the book. It's my favourite of his.
So, there were people around that helped to make it happen. Certainly, a bit of luck. A lot of bad luck. On the second day of filming, his camera got stolen. He left Kevin Brownlow's camera. It was left in a car. And the guy who was supposed to be guarding the car wandered off, and it got stolen. Another time, a camera fell over. The scene that they filmed in the billet, where the two women are talking about what's happened, was apparently a nightmare to film. A Salvation Army band struck up 2 streets away. It was baking, but they had to have all the windows closed because children were playing, dogs were barking. The camera was really noisy and was being picked up by the sound recordist. They were all tired. The camera kept breaking down.
Oh, dear.
So just a little simple scene like that was a nightmare to get through.
That's the thing if you're working on zero budget. Yeah. I read that the budget was £7,000 in the end, which is amazing what they did.
Yeah, I think... an amazing film with some really interesting themes.
Very different from the others. Because, actually, this is the thing I wanted to say. Of course, this is the first film, I think, think we've had, which has had a female protagonist.
Oh, interesting. Yes, good point.
Shows a very different side of the war. I mean, it's the domestic side, resistance side, rather than the heroic men going out there and blowing up a bridge.
Yeah, but I think the questions it asks are very interesting from an historical point of view. You know, thinking that it couldn't happen to us. Of course it could. You question your own...
Yeah, what would I do?
What would you do? Well, of course you don't know. You'd like to think what you do. But also, for current times, I think it's very interesting when you look at the world now, and there's a rise of the right.
Yeah. It's human nature to think it can't happen here, isn't it?
And I think that's the warning. People like Donald Trump, people like the people like the British National Party, I think, are pretty much dead in the water. But Britain first. I know they're a laughing stock, but still, that's how some of these things start.
Yeah.
And if it gets the momentum going, you can suddenly, exactly as you said, little steps that you don't think are too bad, and before you know it, you're injecting the arms of, goodness knows what a horrific thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the next film we're doing, we're going to take a break from the Second World War, or sort of 20th century wars, and we're going to be looking at Zulu. Going into the 19th century.
Yeah.
Which will be very interesting to have that different view. So thank you very much for listening to our podcast about It Happened Here. I hope if you haven't seen the film, well, we've you certainly know about it now, but please go and see the film. I think it's fantastic. Kevin Brownlow lost the rights, United Artists, and they wouldn't give them back. It was not their policy. And he tried several times over the years until eventually a woman took over, or it was the chairman, I don't know what her position was, who he was friendly with, and she made it happen. He got his rights back, and that's why now there is a DVD with that scene of the two fascists dropping back in. So he got his rights back, and Kevin Brownlow's got his own company called Photoplay, who produce all these things, and his restored version of silent films, they show them at film festivals. So that's what he does now.
Yeah.
If you ever get the chance to see something Kevin Brownlow's done, read one of his books. I also read his book on David Lean. He wrote a biography on David Lean, which I referenced for our podcast on
Lawrence of Arabia.
Very good book. He's a brilliant writer. Any of those books, I highly recommend them. I haven't seen Winstanley. I'm curious to see that, actually.
Yeah.
It's not an era I'm as interested in, the English Civil War, but I have actually become more interested in it recently for various reasons. I had a job recently about the Great Fire of London, and so I read about that and got completely enthralled in it. And also my next comic, starring Julius Chancellor, has got a big section rooted in the English Civil War. So I might check out that film as well. But if you ever get a chance to see him talk, if you ever get a chance to see some of his restoration silent films, and he chooses good quality ones, I highly recommend it. But until then, we'll sign off. Hopefully the next War Films podcast won't be too long, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Goodbye.